Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to see how to do image manipulations client side in a React web application. So where this might become valuable is, say you need to send your image off to a remote web server. You don't want your web server to do kind of guesswork when it comes to cropping or resizing, things like that. You want your client to be able to do it before it goes to that web server. This is an example of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, you might recall I've done this with Angular as well as Vue. This time around, we're going to be using React. So we're going to be using the same cropper.js library that you might have seen in other tutorials that I've made. But this time around, we're going to be using React instead of a different web framework. So we are going to be working off of a fresh application. We're not going to be actually doing an HTTP request to a remote web service. I'll point out where you can actually make that HTTP request when the time comes. So let's go ahead and create a new project, and we're going to work our way up. So I'm going to say npx or npm if you already have create React app on your global installation. So we're going to say create React app. I'm going to call it image crop example. So this is just going to create a React web application on my desktop, but go ahead and create it wherever you want or create it however you feel the most comfortable. All right, so it should be on my desktop. So if I wanted to, I can say cd image crop, or I could enter that project directory however seems the most comfortable to you. But let's go ahead and open that up in a IDE of some sort. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code for this example, although you don't have to use Visual Studio Code if that's not your preference. Let me zoom in a bit so that way it's a little easier to see. We're going to start by opening the source directory, and we're going to open up that app.js file. Now, what we're going to do here is we're actually just going to clean it up. This is going to be where we add our image cropping component. So we're actually going to create a component, and then we're going to add it to this app.js file. So let's start by stripping some stuff away. So for example, I don't need everything that's inside of this particular div. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it as a blank kind of div, or as you see here, but I am going to change the indent because by default I think it uses 2 spaces for the tabs, which to me it's going to drive me nuts because my editor is set up to 4 spaces. So I want things to look rather uniform. So I'm going to save it. So this is where we're going to start, and I don't even need this class name. It's a little overkill. We're not going to use the class for this particular example. So I'm going to save it. If I wanted to, I could remove this CSS file, which actually, let's go ahead and do that. Now, I am going to use an image. We're just going to leave this as is. I'm going to change this to a different image when we get there. But for the most part, you want this to look as basic as possible. So the next part is we need to get this cropper.js library. So this is just a standard JavaScript library. It's actually quite popular. It's called Cropper.js. You can install it. It tells you how to install it in the instructions, and it's quite in-depth when it comes to what you can do with this particular tool and how to do it inside of the GitHub documentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and open up a command line right there inside of the IDE. What I'm going to say is npm install. I'm going to say cropper.js, and I'm going to say -- save. So this is installing it to my React application project. All right, perfect. So I am going to clear my terminal. It should be good. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a component. I'm going to create a component for what we plan to do with cropper.js because, well, at the end of the day, we could do it directly inside of this app function. It's probably not the most ideal. It's probably not what you're going to be doing in actual production kind of applications. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say make directory. I'm going to say source components, and then I'm going to say image cropper, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. Actually, I'm going to remove that. I'm going to just say source components. It probably failed because I didn't type in the full path. Actually it didn't fail because I had a source and it just created a components directory there. Next up, so what I'm going to say is I'm going to say maybe touch. I'm going to say source components, and I'm going to call it image cropper.js. So instead of creating an image cropper directory, I'm just adding the components directly inside the components directory. Feel free to modify this to better suit your own development needs or however you have done things in the past for React. But because this is a fresh example, this kind of makes things easy for us. So I have a cropper.js file, or an image cropper.js file. I also want to add a CSS file because we want to be able to style how things behave in this particular example. Because like I mentioned, we're not actually going to be doing the HTTP request with our image. Instead, we're just going to display it graphically on the screen. And to do that, we probably want to add some of our own CSS. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm going to go into the CSS file that we just created, and I'm going to say image. I'm going to call this container. And the whole purpose of this one, this is going to represent the image that we want to modify visually. So it's going to be interactive for the user. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say something like maybe width. I'm going to say 640 pixels. I'm going to say height. I'm going to say maybe 400 or maybe 480 pixels. And then I'm just going to say that this is going to float to the left. This is very basic CSS, but the goal that I'm after here is maybe I want that kind of raw image to appear on the left quite large, and then I'm going to have a preview box on the side of it. That preview box being the edited image that if we wanted to, we could upload that edited image, but we're just going to display it for this example. So I'm going to say image preview, and I'm going to say width. Let's go ahead and say maybe it's 200 pixels. The height is going to be 200 pixels. We're going to float this left as well, so it sits next to the image container. And I'm going to give it a little bit of margin. I'm going to say margin left is maybe, I don't know, 10 pixels. This is simple CSS. I'm by no means a CSS wizard. I'm pretty sure most people can do at least 10 times better than I can when it comes to CSS. But this is our very basic CSS that we're going to work with. So as of right now, we have kind of an empty app.js file. We have some basic CSS. Let's go ahead and open up the image cropper.js file. And this is where we are going to have kind of the bulk of our application logic. So let's go ahead and say import React from React. Let's go ahead and say import cropper from cropper.js. So that's the package that we just downloaded. We also need to get the CSS from that particular package. So the CSS being kind of the what you see is what you get user interface, which we did not design. So the CSS that we added again was just for showing a raw image and a preview next to it. The actual Cropper.js CSS has the interactive kind of fancy components that you're definitely going to want. So we're going to say import. We're going to say Cropper.js. We're going to say dist, and we're going to say cropper.min.css. And you'll notice that this is not a relative path. This is actually going to look inside of my node modules directory for this path. And then finally, I'm going to say import. This is going to be a relative path. I'm going to say image cropper.css. So this is going to be the CSS that we had just created. All right, so let's go ahead and make that class. So we're going to say class image cropper extends react.component. And we are going to use state variables. We're going to be using properties, and we're going to make use of, say, component did mount. So let's go ahead and start with a constructor. We're going to reference super, and we're going to add a state variable. So we're going to say this dot state equals, and let's go ahead and say image destination. And this is going to represent kind of the destination image for our preview. Now we're going to be adding other stuff to the constructor, but let's leave it at that just for now. Next up, let's go ahead and define our render function. So inside of the render, we have return, and let's go ahead and add some HTML. So we're going to say div, and inside the div, let's go ahead and say div class. And this is going to be our image container. So again, our image container being from our CSS file. So we have our image container. Let's go ahead and add our kind of preview. So let's go ahead and say image, and this is going to be class equals image preview. This is just an image tag. Let's close it off there. So this is kind of just vanilla HTML right here. We're not doing anything React oriented yet. So the first step that we want to do is, well, Cropper.js is going to expect our raw image, so our source image. It's actually going to expect the actual image HTML field itself. And we can't necessarily pass in a kind of model variable or a state variable. So instead we have to create a reference variable in React. So actually, let's go ahead and start this. We're going to say image, and we're just going to add to it as we go along. So for the reference variable, to do that in React, well, we should do that inside the constructor. So let's go ahead and create a variable. We're going to say this dot, let's say image element for the HTML element, and we're going to say React dot create ref. So create reference, and we can use that in here on line what is this, 20. So we're going to say ref equals this dot image element. So this is going to represent, this variable is going to represent the reference to this particular HTML item, this component. Next up, we could either hard code the image, which probably wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, or we can ask the user to pass in kind of the path to that image on their own. So what we can do is we can say something like source. So this is a source tag for the image. And we can say this dot props. So this is a property that a user is going to define when they make use of this particular component. And let's just say that they're gonna call this property source as well. All right. And maybe we add an alt tag. So we're going to say maybe this is source. All right. So we have that. Next up, we know that the preview is going to go in this preview kind of image on line 22. So let's go ahead and make use of that state variable. So this image destination. So let's go ahead and say source equals this dot state dot image destination. Let's go ahead and add an alt to it. Let's go ahead and say that this is the destination, and we can save it for now. So we're kind of in good shape. The exception here is that we're not actually doing anything with Cropper.js yet. We've just set the groundwork. We have a reference to the tag that's going to be using Cropper.js, and we also have an image tag that's going to be used for our manipulated client-side image. So let's go ahead and make use of one of React's functions here. We're going to say component did mount. So this is going to happen after our component mounts. So that's when we start making use of Cropper.js. So let's go ahead and say constant cropper. And a lot of this is actually taken from the documentation. This is kind of the base usage. Let's see if I could dig it up. I've used it a few times, so it's kind of in memory. But it's going to look like this right here from the documentation. Basically, we have our reference. We're going to pass in that reference here. And we're going to define any kind of properties for this library, and then any kind of callback functions. So let's go back into the code here. So I'm going to say cropper equals new cropper. We want to pass in the image element, React friendly, because we can't just say something like element.getQuery. What is it? Get element ID, something like that with just vanilla JavaScript. So we're going to say this dot image element dot current, and then all of our properties. So the first property that we're going to say is I don't want this to be zoomable. You might want to be able to zoom in on your image. For this example, I'm going to say no. Next up, scalable. Do you want to be able to scale your image? I am going to say no as well. I'm going to say aspect ratio. This is kind of, do I want this to be a fixed kind of crop box where it's maybe a perfect square always? Or do I want the user to be able to kind of free scale it, or maybe I want it to be 16 by 9? Who knows? I can define it. I'm going to say 1. So this is a perfect 1 by 1 or a perfect square crop box. And then I'm going to define my crop function. So this crop function is every time it detects that a crop has happened from the kind of UI aspect of things, this function is going to be called, at which case I want to grab it and display it in the preview. So what I can say is I can say constant canvas equals cropper dot get cropped canvas. So I have the canvas, and then I'm going to say this dot set state. So I'm going to set that state variable. I'm going to set the image destination, and that's going to be canvas dot to data URL. This is going to be of type PNG, portable network graphic, and I'm going to add a semicolon. So while we are just going to be setting the destination so that way we can immediately render it inside of our render function, hence this line 34, since we're setting the source, this is where you could also do an HTTP request to a remote server. You would just send the data. So this is, I think it's base 64 encoded, but instead we're just going to be setting it to an HTML component so that way it renders it immediately. So let's go ahead and save it. We're going to try it out now. So this is where we actually kind of make use of it. So if I go back into app.js, and we're gonna review everything that we did once we're done, but let's go ahead and include our component. So I'm going to say import image cropper from, and this is a relative path, components / image cropper. Inside of app, or inside of this div tag, I'm going to say image cropper. Remember, we have a source property. That's what we're looking for. And that's it. Now let's go ahead and add an image. I do have one on my desktop that we're going to use. So I'm going to say copy desktop. This is a portable network graphic. I'm going to copy it into my source directory. And we're going to make use of it. So we're going to say, let's see if we can do, I believe we can do this. We're going to try it, see if this works out. I'm going to save it. I know that we're not using this, but we'll leave it there just for now, just for reference. Let's go ahead and run it. So I'm going to say npm start. All right, image cropper does not contain, all right, so I missed a step. So let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go into image cropper.js here. So if I had to guess, I declared this class, but I never actually exported it. So let's go ahead and export it. So I'm going to say export default image cropper. I'm going to save it. Looks like it's probably good this time. So I'm going to go back into my browser. It doesn't, if I had to guess, it doesn't recognize the path to my image here. Well, it actually is failing for other reasons. Did I mean class name? Yeah, probably. Let's go ahead and go back and fix that. So let's go ahead and go into image cropper. This should probably be class name. This should also probably be class name. Save it. Let's see what's going on now. No more errors. It probably can't find the path to my image. So let's go back into our Visual Studio Code. This is where we're going to go into app.js. Let's go ahead and maybe say import my image from, we have a relative path, tracydevs.png. Let's go ahead and maybe call it tracydevs. We're going to say that this is source. Let's go ahead and say tracydevs. I think this should work out better this time. It's building it. Let's go back into the browser. Yeah, looks better. So I'll zoom in. Oop, I zoomed in on the wrong thing. zoom in over here. So we have the image that I was working with. You'll notice that I can move this around, and it's actually showing a preview up here in the right. I can scale it. It is a perfect square because of the aspect ratio that I defined. If I were to try to change the size any other way, it's always going to be a square. And if I wanted to, I could save this image. Well, it's not particularly useful just to show a preview like this. Like I said, in more circumstances than not, you'll actually want to send the image to a remote web server when you're done instead. So that's out of the scope of this particular tutorial, but you can see that we do now have client-side image editing. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. We'll just do a refresher on everything that we did. I created two CSS classes here. I created an image container which represented the large editable image, so kind of the raw image. I created a CSS class name here for the small preview box that we showed on the right. If I look into the image cropper.js file, we've included the CSS from the cropper.js library, or cropper.js library. We included our own custom CSS. We created a state variable for image destination. So this is the edited image. We also created a reference variable for the actual source image component itself. So we set that up inside the render function. So we have the source image. The source image is taking the source property from the user, so from the prior app.js component or wherever you're calling this component from. We have our reference variable defined. We have the destination in place. And then inside of this component did mount, we're actually taking the code, which is pretty much from the documentation itself. We didn't do much. There's actually quite a few properties that you can use, and there's actually quite a few functions within this particular cropper documentation as well. So there's crop, there's zoom, there's scale, there's tons of stuff that you can do with this particular JavaScript package. But in our circumstance, we just took the result of the crop and we added it to our image destination. Likewise, with app.js file, we have this image that I copied over. We have this component that I imported. It didn't work the first time. I had a bunch of errors, but we're making use of the image cropper component that we just created, passing in that image as a source property, and we are doing our manipulations to it. So this is cropper.js. And like I said, I do have other tutorials for Vue and Angular. This is very useful to have in your applications. Back in the day, I used to try to do this all server side, but you know what? It never worked out properly because say I wanted to kind of crop an image, the images were never centered correctly. You never know. At least when you do it this way, the user can do it. There's no guesswork. It makes a better application. If you liked this particular video, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. It's definitely much appreciated. Thank you.